To start with, I found a couple of models I liked online and I went on to print those out using my 3D printer. I thought these two models would work as a means to test out my paints and my painting skills without getting too overwhelmed by feeling as though I should be completing a full-bodied figure or something more complicated. It was also a good chance for me to test the maximum size and dimensions that my Elegoo Mars Pro printer was capable of printing. And after a little bit of light sanding on the demon skull head, I would move on to paint priming using my airbrush. So I found an old cardboard box and decided to turn that into a little painting station to contain the airbrush paint. To be honest, I was so excited to start using the airbrush that I didn't read up on how to use it or view any online tutorials, and it turned out it was going to be a little bit harder to use than I first assumed. I spent a little bit of time playing around with airbrush settings, the compressor's pressure and the flow of the airbrush itself. The main obstacle that I had was just making sure that the paint was thinned down enough so that it would pass through the airbrush nozzle. The first time I tried using it, I kept the paint quite thick. It ended up basically clogging up the entire airbrush. I needed to then strip it down, clean it, reassemble it, which was quite frustrating because I just wanted to get stuck into a little bit of painting before really understanding the mechanics of how the airbrush works and how it all fits together. Eventually, after a little bit of practice, I was ready to move on to painting my skull models. I started by using some Vallejo white primer, as well as some airbrush flow improver, and if needed I could always add some airbrush thinner just to make sure that I didn't have the same problem of thick paint clogging the airbrush nozzle. I start adding the first coat of primer to the model, rotating it as I go, making sure I hit the tops, the sides, the bottom, as well as get inside the crevices. I try not to oversaturate parts of the model with too much paint in one go by lingering for too long with the airbrush. Instead I'm sort of dusting it over in a sort of thin layer and then returning to it later to give it a second coat and to thicken it up. And while the demon skull is drying, I'll move on to the ornamental skull, adding some primer to that one. After both models were completely white, I'd leave them a few hours to fully dry before moving on to the base coat. At this stage I thought it would be a good opportunity to test out the liquid mask that I'd bought. I didn't know how to apply it, I didn't know how effective it would be, but the idea was to put it on the eyes to make sure that they wouldn't be covered by the same base colour as the rest of the head. I selected bone white and earth brown for the base colours that I'd be using on the model. Starting with the darker brown, I began painting the horns of the model and then the underside of the skull. I then moved over to the lighter cream coloured bone colour to do the sort of top of the skull to give a bit more definition and a gradient between the tones. After throwing down some base tones, I peeled off the liquid mask to reveal the unpainted eyes underneath. I did about as much as I wanted to do with the airbrush on this model, so then I moved on to paint brushes. I begin by selecting the colours I'll be using, and I needed to just fill in the rest of the base colour that didn't quite pick up with the airbrush on the inside of the eyes. Now, this being the first time I'd painted anything in decades meant it was going to take me hours to complete, and it was a big trial and error process for me to find out how things would work. I knew the general gist would be for me to start with the base tone and then add a darker wash of colour to get into the crevices and the underparts of the model. Then I'd start trying to blend in some highlights and lighter colours, followed by some final detailing at the end. And here I'm going to show a few speeded up time lapses of the process. This is where I am after the first stage of painting. On to the next stage. Here I've skipped ahead to the part where I'm now working on the horns. And the last part is working on the eyes. I used pretty thin coats of paint over the entirety of the model, and the eyes especially ended up taking several coats of red just to finish up. And here we have the final result. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out and looking forward to working on the next one. With the Ornamental Skull, it was all about using a special type of paint. I combined some Airbrush Flow Improver with Arteza's iridescent black paint, which has a kind of gold sheen to it. I was keen to see how that would look when applied to a 3D model, as opposed to its probably typical application on 2D canvases and paper. As before, I started slowly building up a base tone colour using the airbrush. And to give it a little bit more tone and depth, I mixed up some black paint and applied that more towards the underside of the model. And here's how it looked after a few coats of paint. It has a really unusual finish which looks very different whether it's under direct sunlight, in the shadow, or under harsher artificial lights. I've included a few photos as well so you can see what it looks like under a more diffused type of light source. I'd say it looks a little bit more bronze rather than black with gold specks in it. To make the filigree pattern on the top and the sides more detailed, I went around it using a thinned down black paint. And then using a metallic gold paint to accent the filigree itself. And just to add a little bit more extra contrast, I added some dry brushing to the edges of the skull using gold. The shadows and highlights are quite subtle, but do help give the model just a little bit more depth. And here is the final result. I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. I finished off by just giving it a couple of coats of gloss varnish, and it was pretty fun just to see how different types of paints can work with 3D prints. Thanks for checking these out. Next time I hope to be working on something a little bit more complicated, so it'll be fun to see how that ends up working out.